So I would like to begin where we left off and just kind of reiterate the last slide of our class on Wednesday when we were discussing how the mind resembles that of a computer or a machine. And so just like when your computer is doing multiple things at once, or your phone is multitasking and has 900 apps open, the mind also has 900 apps open. It is constantly perceiving and conveying emotion and receiving emotion and thinking, feeling, dreaming, thinking about motivations. It's doing everything at once all the time. Now, some of those apps might be running in the background. Some of those processes are running in the background. But they are all occurring at the same time. And when that happens, oftentimes bugs can occur, just as it happens in your computer when a program quits running and it wants to send diagnostics, to whoever created that program. Your brain wants to send diagnostics to another portion of the brain to kind of say, hey, we made this mistake, and to learn from that mistake. So, I thanked a red box machine earlier. It's an inanimate object. Let's learn from that, and let's, we won't let it happen again next time. Let's report this bug to the main user, the main producer, which is yourself. So, understanding these lapses and errors, and occasionally, the puzzling nature of human behavior provides a vantage point for understanding the normal operations. So, like I said in class on Wednesday, we like to understand how things work by understanding, how they're broken and why they break. So, don't forget, same situation with the story I told you about the man that had everything together and then lost it all due to the fact that one of his processes, the emotional part, quit working. So he was unable, which emotions guide your judgment and your behavior a lot of the time. So because of that, it made the whole computer die. The whole brain made mistakes. So moving on, we talked about a few early schools of thought in last class, and now we'll move on to the next school of thought, which is known as Gestalt Psychology. So Gestalt it's mainly the opposite of structuralism, where structuralism looks at the individual parts, what functions well in each individual part, in your perception, in your consciousness, your memory, your emotions, and it focuses on those parts as individuals. Well, Gestalt theory takes all of those individuals and says, well, without one, you can't have the rest of them, or at least they won't function properly, much like we just discussed as the mind being a machine. So, just as you take the motherboard or the hard drive out of your computer, and it's not going to work, even though you have all of the other components of a computer. So Gestalt, it really focuses, it's very popular in cognitive psychology, and it really focuses on perception, learning, memory, thought processes, and problem solving, but it combines them all into one, and then they're all interconnected and use one another to produce the rest. And so one of the main phrases, I guess catchphrases of Gestalt psychology is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So each one of those individual parts, learning is not worth a lot if you don't have memory. If you sit here and learn all of this but you don't remember it, are you really learning? And so all of those combined will produce a greater function than just one of them standing alone. So now we go on to the ever-famous Freud. And we discussed last class period when we were talking about what comes to mind when I say psychology to someone that has not learned a lot about psychology, that has not at least completed an introductory psychology course. So Freud, very popular. Everybody loves him, everybody knows him. But let's take a look at some of his early works and the contributions that he made to the field of psychology. So Freud began with hysteria. He was looking at patients that were exhibiting forms of hysteria, and he began making his own observations and developing theories to explain strange behaviors and symptoms in these patients, which he then called these strange behaviors and symptoms hysteria. So he theorized that most of the problems that many of his patients were exhibiting could be traced to the effects of painful childhood experiences that they could no longer remember. So they were outside of their conscious awareness. They were in their unconscious. And that's not to say they were unconscious like in a coma, just they were not in their readily available thoughts. And so they referred to these as lost memories. These lost memories could reveal things that were going on in the unconscious mind, and then would then lead to an explanation as to some of the strange behaviors that these patients were exhibiting. So according to Freud, the unconscious mind is the part of the mind that operates outside of conscious awareness, but it influences your conscious thoughts, feelings, perceptions, actions, desires, etc. All of those mental processes that we discussed within the definition of psychology. So this idea led to the development of the psychoanalytic theory. And with this approach, it emphasizes the importance that the unconscious mental processes have on shaping your thoughts and your feelings and your behaviors. And from this standpoint, it would be important to uncover all of these early experiences that a person has and to illuminate those unconscious anxieties, conflicts, and desires so that you could then alter their strange behaviors. So interestingly, most of the conflicts and past experiences that Freud emphasized were on sex and aggression. Freud was big on sex and aggression. He absolutely, that was like his science baby. So while normal people deal with these conflicts, everyone deals with conflicts of sex and aggression, but while normal people deal with these conflicts, it's when they become extreme, it's when they begin to affect your daily life that they result in psychological disorders. So this emphasis on sexual and aggressive desires made his theory really controversial in the field of psychology, because back then it was like, well, you want to talk to me about sex? Like, no, thank you. It's the early 1900s. And so this topic was very taboo. So psychoanalytic theory was born. Interesting side note about Freud. He was actually the first psychologist to be honored with their own bobblehead doll. Looks just like him. I was the second. So it was a gift from my mother. All right, so continuing with Freud and psychoanalysis, I'd first like you to look at, what do you notice about this picture? It's all men. And that's due to the fact that men were really the most influential, and they were really the only ones allowed to pursue an education at this point in time. So Freud stressed the importance of those early childhood experiences, and he believed that personality was formed within the first 6 years of life. So everything that you are and the way that you act and the personality that you carry, Freud would say that all developed within the first 6 years of life. So if there were particular problems, if you had some sort of mental disorder or you were going through this hysteria, as he called it, they must have developed very early on. So how they developed this idea is that Freud's patients suffered they suffered from nervous disorders, but they couldn't find any physical evidence. So you could find nothing physically wrong with these people. And so they thought, well, it must be in the mind. If I can't physically see it, it has to be something mental. And so he proposed that the unconscious memories that we repress or that we push down, all of our threatening urges and desires, that these were trying to surface, and those trying to surface and us trying to combat them and repress them again was what created these nervous disorders. Thus emerges psychoanalysis. And this is kind of the basis of modern psychotherapy, and we'll talk about that later on. But psychoanalysis is a process in which a trained individual helps a person gain insight into their repressed memories and subsequent and the weird behaviors that go along with these bad memories. And so they try and bring about these bad memories and make you basically relive them. There's a reason you're repressing them most of the time. It's usually due to, you were sexually abused as a child, or, even physically abused as a child, things like that. So very negative things. So most historians will tell you that Freud was one of the top three, two or three influential thinkers of the 1900s. And they're right. Psychoanalytic theory influenced everything from literature to history to politics and art. And, you think about it, how many of you guys have heard of Freud? Everyone's heard of him in one form or another. So within psychology, Freud had the greatest influence on clinical practice. And this is really what you would probably think of when you think of psychology, going in, sitting down, maybe on a leather couch, how do you feel about that? Those types of things. And although his theories have greatly diminished in the last 40 years, they're actually still used in certain schools. They're still taught in certain schools, very specifically in the Northeast of the United States. So they were lost. A lot of people gave up these theories due to the fact that they were very dark. He wanted to look at sex and aggression, but he wanted to look at them in like a you were sexually abused as a child kind of way. And this was an issue for people, especially since this kind of, in the years following the development of the psychoanalysis theory, World War II was ending and we were trying to be upbeat and positive. Greater technology was being created. We had higher standards of living. All of these things, we were moving up in the world, and Freud, being a Debbie Downer that he is, was trying to say, well, all of these horrible things happen to you, and that's why you act this way. So, that was one of the problems and one of the reasons that his theories were, have been kind of repressed, for lack of a better word. But also because his ideas were really difficult to test. It's difficult. There was not a very scientific methodology in order to look at all of these and to determine whether or not this was accurate. And as we've found out, and as you will continue to find out, the scientific methodology is very important in being able to objectively look at something. Moving on from Freud, we'll now look at some schools of thought that are more popular today and more widely used in today's psychology. So, in the early 1900s, we talked about the three schools of thought, the three main schools: structuralism, functionalism, and finally psychoanalysis. And each of these is substantially different from one another, but they all shared one important similarity, and that is that each tried to understand the inner workings of the mind by examining conscious feelings, emotions, thoughts, memories, perceptions, all of those things that make up mental processes. But because these were all self-report, it was very difficult to figure out what was going on because it's very subjective. It's hard to be objective due to all the biases. And if you remember when we talked about the definition of biases, it's just a belief or opinion that is not based on fact. So it's very difficult to be objective when you're talking about yourself. You're usually very subjective and try and, kind of up the ante, basically. So as the 1900s unfolded, a new approach began to develop. And this was known as behaviorism. And this was because they wanted to quit focusing on, all of these thoughts and feelings, and they wanted to actually look at the observable behaviors. And so if you think back to the definition of psychology, that's the second part of that definition. It's the scientific study of behavior, of those observable actions. And so they called this idea behaviorism. And it advocated that psychologists should restrict themselves to the scientific study of observable behavior. So this was obviously a very dramatic shift in the schools of thought. We're now not just looking at perceptions and what's going on in the conscious mind. Now we're looking at focusing on what people do rather than what they experience. And there were a lot of influential people that came about in the behaviorism. Often, a lot of you may have heard of Pavlov's dog, who Ivan Pavlov discovered conditioning reflexes in dogs. And we'll talk about that in detail in the learning chapter. Watson extended that approach. He took it from dogs and he extended it to human behavior. And then Skinner, he furthered this conditioning. So over here we've got Ivan Pavlov, Watson, as well as Skinner. And this photo is going to be hyperlinked if you would like to see a bit of the research that Watson used to extend Pavlov's idea of conditioning to humans. Humanistic psychology came about the same time, slightly after behaviorism, and it was a reaction to both psychoanalytic and behaviorism. So humanistic psychology really was a reaction to psychoanalytic and behaviorism. So it was a combination of the two, and it came about because of those two, just as psychology, the field of psychology, came about as a reaction to philosophy, physiology, phrenology, all of those previously looked at sciences. And so what humanistic psychology did is it focused more on the external forces that were shaping human behavior. So it was less about the internal mental processes that was shaping behavior, and it was more so about what was happening out there that affected me and affected and changed my behavior. And so humanism focused on the ability for people to direct their own lives, for them to carve their own path and create their own destiny. And it really emphasized the high aspirations that people had for themselves. So rather than prisoners of their remote past, as Freud would have you believe, humanistic psychology viewed people as free agents. And they were really trying to reach this self-actualization, to reach their full potential in life. And so also at this time, they made that switch from calling these people patients, and they started referring to them as clients. And this not only made the clients feel that they were on equal footing with their therapist, but it also, it was less of a negative stigma, and it wasn't like, oh, there must be something wrong with me. It was more so that they were just receiving something for pay. In return for pay, they were receiving a service. And so while Freud emphasized all these limitations and these problems, humanistic psychology aimed to understand human nature by studying the positive potential as opposed to the negative. So the movement of the humanistic psychology, it really came about, it reached its peak, at least, in the 1960s, and this was the generation of flower children, which is, you can tell from the photo. So, within humanistic psychology, Abraham Maslow was a prominent humanist, and he developed this hierarchy for needs. And basically, this idea is that before you can start achieving self-actualization and being the best you that you can be, you had to have all of your previous needs met. All of the other needs had to be met. And so Wi-Fi is obviously on there as a joke. However, you had to first have food and shelter, warmth. After that, you had to be stable, possibly in this day and age, a secure job, and being able to pay all of your bills and keep up financially, at least feed yourself. And then after that, be able to build relationships. You had to have both, romantic as well as platonic relationships with others, and this was really important. We'll learn a lot this semester about how incredibly important the development of relationships with others is to our health, both our mental and our physical health. And so then after all of those needs are met, then you can start focusing on being the best you that you can possibly be and reaching that self-actualization. So just in review, psychology in the 21st century did a lot. If we remember back when we're looking at all of the philosophy that was being done, from the 4th century with Plato and Aristotle, they did a lot, but then we jump ahead all the way to the 17th century, and Descartes is still looking at philosophy. Psychology wasn't created, and so within such a short time frame, psychology has become it's developed so many different areas to look at. So it's pretty incredible how quickly this field has grown, and is still growing, even though we consider it to be a new science. Especially when you compare it to that of philosophy and all of the physiology, all of the things that came before it. So those were some of the early perspectives, and now we get into some of the more modern perspectives, and I mean things that were done in the last, 100 years. A lot of these can often be confused with these early principles. Now, when I say that, I don't want you to confuse psychodynamic and behavioral with psychoanalytic and behaviorism, or behaviorist. So we'll just go through a couple of these, and these are not by any means all of the modern perspectives. They are just to give you some idea of how broad the field of psychology actually is. So psychodynamic, it's similar to psychoanalytic, but not the same. It still focuses on the subconscious, on the unconscious, but less on sex and aggression. It's kind of trying to reach that more positive standpoint. It's, let's not be so negative. So still focuses on all of the unconscious thoughts, feelings, perceptions, emotions, dreams, less on sex and aggression as like the underlying cause of behavior. And then there is behavioral. And so this really furthered from behaviorism. Behaviorism was here, and they were like, we're going to go up here with it. And this was brought about by Skinner, B.F. Skinner, and we'll talk a lot about him as well. And they looked at theories on operant and classical conditioning and reinforcement. And so that you can see not only in Pavlov's dog, but we'll talk about that in detail in the learning chapter. I'll skip humanistic because I just explained it, and it's very much the same. It's a very modern perspective. And head right along to cognitive. Now, cognitive focuses on memory, intelligence, perception, thought, problem solving, language, learning, you name it, it focuses on it. And so obviously it's quite a bit. It's all the stuff that's going on in here that allows you to, get through on a day-to-day basis. And then within cognitive, there is cognitive neuroscience. And this is really actually the physical workings of the brain and the nervous system and how it engages in all of those previous processes that I just mentioned. And so you can see, when you're learning or when you're using language, specific areas of the brain will light up. And that's what neuroscience really focuses on. And then there is sociocultural. And this is exactly like it sounds. It is a combination of both social psychology as well as cultural psychology. And this basically looks at the effect that people have on one another. So how you affect my behavior and vice versa, both individually and in the group aspect. So it's both with just maybe me and you, but also with me and the entire class, or vice versa. And then biopsychological psychology. It's behaviors that are a direct result of bodily influences or affects. So hormones and heredity, brain chemicals, all of the brain chemicals that you have, and we'll talk about those next chapter. Tumors, diseases, all of that good stuff, and how it really can affect your behavior as a whole, because some of those behaviors are going to be due to hormones or hereditary. And then finally evolutionary, and this goes back to Darwin's idea of natural selection, basically that behaviors that occur must be adaptive or they would not have been passed down from a previous generation. So now I just want to give you some idea as to, all of the different areas that you can go into as far as profession in psychology. So once again, when you talk about psychologists, people typically think, oh, you're a counselor or, a therapist. And then they stop there, which my family still thinks that about me. So it's like you could explain it until you're blue in the face, and I have. But this should give you some idea that that is definitely not the only place you can be, although it is a large portion. So the subfields are informed to a degree by the perspectives, by all those previous perspectives that we looked at, the evolutionary, the biopsychological, humanistic, etc. But psychologists also engage in interdisciplinary studies such as psychohistory, psycholinguistics. The list goes on and on. I mean, it literally goes on and on. So it never ends. Developmental, psychophysiological, that's my title. I mean, it really never ends. Research is not the only career. Research is what most of your professors in psychology and many other fields that you will see at this university, that's what they engage in, because we are a research-oriented university. But it's not the only career for a psychologist, as you can tell by this wonderful graph. So most people that call themselves psychologists are neither researchers, but they either assess, or teachers, but they either assess people with psychological problems in some way. And they're known as clinical psychologists who work in private practice. Some psychologists, like I said, have faculty positions at universities. Some combine private practice with academic jobs. But many clinical psychologists will mainly focus on very specific mental disorders. So, as you can tell by the graph, clinical and counseling make up well over half of the specialties in psychology, but there are a number of other ones. Industrial organization, you will typically work for a large corporation. Educational and school, you're going to work in some form of either educational, higher education, and school, possibly be a junior high or a high school counselor. Cognitive, it might be helping people learn new methods for memory, new methods for learning, etc. It goes on and on forever. So, research careers, I'll talk specifically about this, mainly just because this is what this university focuses on. If you choose to major in psychology, I have news for you. There are very few jobs with a Bachelor of Science or Arts in psychology. So the majority of undergraduate psychology majors will continue on to grad school. Within that, you can get your master's and do counseling or social work. You could get your PhD, which is how you do research and also be a professor. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a research career. And then you can go on and you can do another 3 years after your 5 to 6 years of PhD. And you can do a postdoctoral fellowship, which you get specialized training in one specific area. So after that, you can either, you can get a job as faculty, research, clinical. In clinical, you can do hospitals, universities, everything. There's really no end once you get there. So, and finally, this is just a division of once people go into the workforce, what settings they'll actually be working on. And so, as you can see, the most of them will do profit organizations or self-employment, so private practice. They might own their own practice. Whereas others are going to work at universities and in hospitals. So very few of them actually work for the government when they finish. But if you did, you might be, say, an Army psychologist. I'm always getting emails to become an Army psychologist. It's too late. So I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Please feel free to email me with any questions that you may have, and I will see you Monday morning. Thanks.